I'm the positive support specialist for Clark County. And what that kind of means, traditionally, when you heard that role, a lot of times what people might call that is a behavior support specialist. And we're trying hard not to use that kind of language, mainly because the word behavior, the field has really kind of, I want to say, polluted that word over the last 20 years and really kind of twisted it around to mean a lot of stuff that it tends to mean people kind of automatically have a negative reaction to it, that it's bad, that these folks are scary, these behavior people are somehow really different or really hard to work with or things like this. And part of the conversation I want to have is trying to break that down. And this is essentially kind of like part two of something that we started in November with. I don't know that any of the folks that are here now were here in November, but that's actually okay, because it's not like this has to be, it's not like you guys are coming in too late or anything, because the same ideas are still going to kind of pertain. Notice the title of this thing, right? Connections between risks, restrictions, and quote unquote behaviors, okay? What I've done at the county is I've created a couple of tools that the SSAs are starting to use that are basically little, it's not like a state requirement. It's not a state thing that they say you have to fill out. It's nothing like that. It's essentially something to kind of help out with brainstorming when we're thinking about these two big areas that tend to be connected to when we think about behavior stuff. One of those is risks, because risk is what we really want to be focused on when we're talking about behaviors and about behavior concerns with people. And then this whole notion of restrictions, which is often where we end up going when we're dealing with people who are having quote unquote behaviors. And I'm going to focus primarily on the restriction part today, because I think it's really important for us to kind of have an understanding of what we mean when we say restriction, why restriction is concerning, and how to determine if you might be doing something restrictive that actually isn't necessary, that you actually don't necessarily intend to be restrictive, or that actually isn't really justified in being restriction because it doesn't really meet that level of risk that we've talked about that the state requires. Sarah has the tool where we talked about risk on the first session of this back in November, and I'm going to suggest that I'm going to go ahead and email you guys the tool that I talk about today as well regarding restrictions, which basically has a ton of examples on it. And I'm going to talk with you guys a bit about examples today as well. I would encourage the providers, this is nothing you have to do. Again, this is not state rule. This is not state requirement. This may be something useful just for your own education. If you are working with a team and trying to figure out what is going on, trying to figure out what next steps need to be taken. We've got an interesting mix of folks in here, because a lot of you guys are independents, and or we've got two shared living providers too. And both of those you folks tend to be in slightly different situations than the agency providers, where they've got multiple staff coming in and out of the home 24 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about restrictions, the examples that we're going to talk about are going to be kind of broad and generalized. There's going to be a temptation to say, like, well, wait a minute, let me talk about this specific thing, or let me talk about that specific thing, or let me, I want to do kind of a deep dive into like my specific thing. This really isn't the environment for that. We don't have the time for it. More importantly, we don't have the knowledge for it. Because anything specific with your individual or with individuals that you're working with, your first point of contact really needs to be your SSA. And there's a couple of specific reasons for that. One of them is because, like I said, this word behavior has really gotten polluted over the years, and has really kind of gotten twisted into like behavior is like its own separate thing, right? Well, we have services that we provide people, but then we have behavior support services, right? We actually used to have something called behavior support plans. And if some of you guys are familiar with that language, I think it's really important to know that phrase, behavior support plan, has not been in existence in state rule since 2015. Mm-hmm. Okay? Good. What that means is any way that we're supporting anybody behaviorally, whether it's the most positive thing you can possibly imagine, or whether it's a really intensive physical intervention because this is what is required to keep that person safe. Anything within the scope of those things is directly in the IP. And I think that's a good thing, because I think we have artificially separated out behavior from the rest of the plan and acted like, well, your medical concerns and your interactions with people and your financial stuff and how you get around in the community and blah blah blah, that all sits in one chunk, and then your behavior sits over in the other chunk. It doesn't make any sense. So we've got things a lot more integrated, and that's very intentional. When I start talking about some of these things today, if you've got questions about specific folks that you're working with, the first thing you're going to want to do is go to the SSA of that individual, because that's where you guys are going to start to work on those really specific little details that we're talking that are going to really what do I want to say, have some very specific give you some really specific direction on how you want to approach things. Okay. Mm-hmm. So having kind of said that, which I realize probably seems a little vague, I'm going to jump further ahead in the presentation here, and then I'm going to kind of blow the screen up big. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to start giving you guys a bunch of examples, okay? We're scheduled until 2 o'clock, correct? Is that everybody's here until 2?
Yeah. I'm leaving at 1:30.
We're scheduled for, just so I can kind of keep an eye on the time. So if we don't go that long, that's awesome. But I want to make sure we've got enough time. So if we start to talk about the examples, I may slow us down or speed us up a little bit, just depending on how the time frame goes. But so I mentioned that because I don't want you guys to feel like I'm like cutting you off or being rude or anything like that. Okay. So everybody good so far? General questions? Is anybody like, I have no idea what's going on or even where I'm at? Nobody's completely lost yet. Okay, sweet. That's always a good starting point. Okay. Here, let me blow this up big for you. So I want to start talking about this idea of risk and restriction, because when we talk about risk and when we talk about risk of harm, the phrase risk of harm has a very specific meaning in the state rule. But at the same time, risk is not a simple yes or no question. Risk, I would contend, is there are degrees of risk that go on with things, right? And those degrees are affected by lots of factors. It's important to remember that a significant risk of harm is the only time that's appropriate, the restriction to be in place. I want us to try to get out of the mindset that risk is like the box that needs to be checked in order to authorize restrictions, okay? So if like there's something going on, if there's a restriction or something occurring, I want folks to really keep into their heads that it's not like don't have your intervention, your strategy, your whatever's going on, don't have that in place and then go, now I got to figure out how to justify it. Well, let me see if I can come up with a risk that's going to justify this. That's really backwards. Does that make sense? Like that's really kind of an example of the tail wagging the dog. We need to address the risk first. We need to acknowledge that first and then say, okay, what is it, these things that we're doing? How are the things that we're doing? How are they attending to the risks and the concerns that we've got? Okay. The other important thing to remember is restriction is only approved when there is a risk of harm and when supportive strategies have tried and have failed. Okay. So that's the two-part thing, right? It's not just enough to say like, oh, somebody's at risk, therefore I need to immediately go to a really I need to immediately go to like a really extreme example. I need to immediately start to lock all their knives up, or I need to immediately start to physically intervene with them, or I need to immediately do this. We have to show that we're trying other things, or that at least other things have tried and those didn't sufficiently take care of the risk. Okay. So those two things. For restriction to be appropriate, it's risk of harm, and that's the thing that we have to do because other things aren't working. Okay. This phrase will pop up occasionally out of people when we're talking about how we're deciding if we're doing a strategy with somebody, whether or not something is restricted. And the comment that's made sometimes is, well, that's not a rights restriction, it's a health and safety concern. And I think what that comment is usually attending to more, or what the person is trying to say more, is, well, this is not something that the person is intentionally doing. This is not a behavior. This is like a medical risk or something like that. This is, and I'll actually get into a much better example of that here in a couple of slides. But the concern there of saying, well, no, that's not restriction, that's health and safety, that's not logical or accurate, because by state rule, health and safety is the only reason the risks are ever restricted. Okay. So it's important that we don't fall into that health and safety thing and think, well, that automatically kind of means that what we're doing isn't restrictive, or we don't have to consider it restrictive. Health and safety does not determine whether or not an intervention is restricted. Okay. And I also want to mention throughout this, when I'm talking about restriction doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? There are some restrictions that we do with folks that are really, really important and really, really necessary. Okay. So I don't want anybody to mishear that I'm saying restriction is bad. What I am saying is restriction is very powerful. Restriction can be very detrimental to people, even if it's trying to help them in certain ways. It may be very traumatic or frustrating, or actually leading to other problems in other ways. So restriction is not bad, but restriction is quite powerful. And that's why we need to be really clear on this, okay? So health and safety does not determine whether or not something's restricted. So how do you determine whether or not something is restricted? So this answer is not state rule language, because to be very honest, state rule can tell you what a person's rights are. And if you're doing something against those rights, then inherently that is restrictive, okay? But state rule doesn't break it down like this. So with that caveat, this is SAM language to some degree, but I think this is also touching on the generalized approach that is consistent with state rule. And what that basically means is restriction is determined by how much control the individual has over the intervention or the strategy. The vast majority of the time we're talking about intervening with people or working with people, because intervention that's a highfalutin word, right? That sounds real technical and real, I'm going to intervene with you. Sometimes your intervention is just talking with somebody, right? Sometimes your intervention is saying, hey, how you doing? Okay. So don't let words like intervention, strategy, et cetera, don't let that start to make it feel like it's too like clinical. What we're talking about is in those situations when you're interacting with somebody, how much control does the person have over that? And I don't mean how much self-control do they have, because I know sometimes when folks are having behavioral problems, you can point out and go, well, they're not in control at all. They have absolutely no control over themselves. That's not the type of control I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is what power and choice they have to start, stop, or change the intervention or support. And again, the intervention or support, that means that can be something as intensive as physical restraint. That can be just, hey, I need to be in this room to talk with you right now, or I need to give you certain piece of advice. How much control and choice do they have in those situations? In general, the less the individual is allowed to change or control the situation, the more restrictive that situation is, okay? So, some general examples of things that people might say that can sound restrictive and may or may not actually be restrictive, okay? And this is not, I've got another slide in a couple of minutes here that talks about that this is not about playing like word police or like picking on people for like specific words that they're using, but it is about thinking about what exactly it is you're saying and what you're saying actually means, okay? So if you as a provider tell the county board or somebody else or a state reviewer or the individual themselves, he isn't allowed to go outside at night. He isn't allowed to go outside at night. What does that mean? And that would be my first comment is what do you mean he's not allowed? Meaning if he tries to go outside If he asks to go outside, what is your response going to be? Okay. Because sometimes statements like this, what they mean is like, well, look, it's a really bad idea for him to go outside. And if he goes outside, I tell him, hey, let's not do this. Let's come back in here. Let's et cetera, let's all this. But it comes down to, well, do you literally like stand and like block the door and go, no, you're not going to go outside? And sometimes people are like, oh, no, I don't do that. You mean I like actually physically stop him from going outside? No, I don't do that. Okay, that's really important to know, because from a statement like that, he isn't allowed to go outside. It's not really clear, right? It's not really clear what you are or aren't doing when you're interacting with the person in that situation. We don't let her buy Diet Pop, okay? What's the concerning word there in this? We don't let her buy Diet Pop. What's the word there that makes it, that brings up some question of how much control you as a provider or the individual has in the situation? There's one word there. If anybody's answering, you're on mute.
So yeah, I was on the we don't.
It's you're close. It's let. It's let. And the reason why is because who's letting the person do it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And again, what does that mean? What does that? So like I said, I'm really not trying to pick on people and play word police. I'm really not. But what does that look like? We don't let her buy Diet Pop. Meaning, if she tries to buy a pop, you like snatch it out of her hand, or you like yank the money away from her, or you like prohibit her, you like refuse to drive her to a grocery store if she says she's going to buy Diet Pop, or like, what does that look like? Okay.
Right.
He can only play video games once he's cleaned up after dinner. Now, shared living, folks, this is where we start to get into some interesting things, because we start to talk about structure, right? And how much of home life is the structure that we've established in the house and the routine that we've established. How does that play into this? And those are very fine lines. What I would say is this: what it comes down to is restrictive means the person truly is not allowed. Meaning, if he starts to put the video game in, I do something in response to that. I take the controller away. I hide the video game. I unplug the power cord and throw it in a locked closet. Do you see what I'm saying? Something where I'm really exerting power over the situation, so that the person does not have the choice to be able to make this situation. Now, we've got lots of folks where structure is really important, and where and where it's really important that they know what to expect, right? I know we have folks who would do all kinds of things, whether it's play video games or, eat junk food or stay up all night watching TV or all other kinds of crazy, dangerous stuff, that they would do that all the time if they didn't have somebody else giving them that guidance, right? Again, guidance and structure and things is different than I'm imposing some kind of penalty on you, okay? And we'll get into this a little bit further again later on, okay? But so I just want to throw that out to the, because I know with shared living, this is where it gets this whole notion of structure and what to expect and what people, and especially when you've got somebody living in a house with you where you're trying to, you have some control over the house, as opposed to an independent provider who may be walking into another individual, who you're going into the individual's house, and it's that person's home, right? They're renting that apartment, or they're living there, or they're, those environments are slightly different. But, and please hear this, shared living, once you guys are being paid, especially by Medicaid, it casts everything in a little different of a realm. I would also encourage people not to try to get into this idea of, well, I'll do things by Medicaid rule when I'm getting paid, but when I'm not getting paid, I'm going to do them slightly differently. That's a fiasco. That doesn't work. And it doesn't work mainly for two reasons. Because first of all, it's you trying to game the system, and you're not going to be able to keep it straight, and it's just not going to work out right. Secondly, and to me far more importantly, it's not consistent for the person. The person you're working with isn't really registering when you're on the clock or when you're off the clock, right? So don't, you know, again, this is like when I'm talking about these things that like have some like nuance and shade to them, please don't take this as like, oh, okay, I got to figure out how to manipulate this. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is a broader conversation about how we're really interacting with people. Okay. Similar comments, but well, I made him give the money back. Well, what do you mean made? I prevented her from leaving. Prevented how? Meaning asked her to stop, meaning grabbed her in a bear hug and said, no, you're not going anywhere. And this last comment, the guardian told me to keep the bedroom door open when his boyfriend visits. Okay. This also gets interesting because I threw it in here intentionally because this starts to get into, well, it's the guardian, right? Well, the guardian said that I'm supposed to do this. The guardians are important for maintaining health and safety and for making sure that people are being safe. But guardianship can be complicated. And guardians do not automatically have the ability to control every single aspect of a person's life. And that is not me saying that. That is per probate court rules and instructions. And I know that can be kind of hard sometimes for guardians because they feel like, look, this person's been deemed incompetent. They need somebody to keep them safe. They need somebody, so I've got to be the one in charge. We're not saying you can't make decisions for that person, but we are saying there's got to be good, clear reasons for why we're doing some of these things. Okay. And I'm gonna touch on that, the whole guardian natural support thing a little bit more in another example coming up here. So we'll keep going here. Now, just so everybody doesn't feel like I'm just picking on things providers are saying, here are some things that might get written into a plan. And I've done this training with the SSAs as well, just so you guys know. Here's some things that might get written into a plan that can sound restrictive and may or may not be restrictive. You got a comment, if there's a comment written in the plan, he must go to bed by 10 o'clock to get enough sleep for work. If I was a provider and I'm reading that statement, I'm taking this person on, you know, from the SSA and I'm reading over this service plan. What does that mean? Must go to bed. Meaning we literally shut all the power off in the house at 10 o'clock? You know, and I know that sounds like a bit of an extreme example, but I throw that out there because, first of all, like occasionally there are like real people have taken things to that level because it's like, well, no, that's what it says, and so this is it. That secondly, if it's a conversation about helping that person have a good bedtime routine, which is important, because it's very important for people to have bedtime routines. And actually, most of us have a bedtime routine, whether or not we call it a bedtime routine or not. It's very important to help people develop those bedtime routines. But notice that is different than having a bedtime, right? That's different than saying you have to go to bed at 10 o'clock, okay? Guardian states he isn't allowed to have staff take him out more than twice a week. And I'm going to go ahead and tie that into the next one too. Due to diabetes, she can only have 2 pops a day. When we're talking about dietary stuff, it's really important to have really clear distinctions from doctors on what is and isn't important, and also what does and does constitute unsafe or risk or things like this. This can also be kind of hard to hear because this is where we have to figure out how to give folks enough room to make mistakes and errors and to be able to learn from them without making catastrophic mistakes. I would call it being able to fall down without falling off a cliff. Okay. So you might have someone who, if smoking is a concern, and you've got someone who's turning 18 and the guardian is saying he is not going to start smoking. We all know smoking is horrible for you. And he's got family members that died from lung cancer. And no, he is absolutely, and we start to no. I'm not saying that smoking is a great thing to start to get into, but there is a difference in the level of risk for someone who has never smoked before and how we need to support them in that, as opposed to somebody I worked with who we did have a restriction around smoking because he did not understand that his roommate used oxygen and he would try to smoke around his roommate who he was using oxygen. Okay. One of those situations is a long-term chronic health condition that is important and serious, and that we have to really work through and have to really talk about, understand, right? The other situation's a bomb, okay? Because that's what smoking around an oxygen tank is. That's a bomb. That's immediate. That's right now, okay? Those are those are kind of, let's call those two different polar ends of things, right? When we're talking about these health concerns, we have to talk about within there, this is where you have to get into trying to determine what that level of risk is for this person and for the thing that they're trying to do, okay? Last example I got down there is actually pretty close to it's almost verbatim from what somebody wrote. And I think it's important to hear, just because this wasn't well, I'll just read it. During alone time, she has to call the provider every 2 hours to check in. Otherwise, she loses the alone time. This is the concern with how that is written, or how that gets understood. What that starts to sound like then is that if this person isn't calling their provider or calling someone to check in with them, then they've somehow done something wrong and they are being penalized for it. Hence, she loses alone time. Do you guys hear that? Now, the general statement behind, or the general sentiment behind the statement actually is completely right, and I completely agreed with. This person, we needed to know where this person was every 2 hours. We needed to be aware of where this person was every 2 hours. She needed to have some kind of contact with somebody every 2 hours. If she could call in with somebody for at least once every couple hours, that's perfect. If for some reason she couldn't or wouldn't or was unable to, then what she needed was not a penalty of losing the alone time. She just needed staff there with her to double check with her on things. Slight difference, but I think it's important because one basically just focuses on what her supervision level is. What I just described to you guys talks about her supervision level. This, the way it's written, makes it sound like, well, if she doesn't do what we said, she's going to be in trouble. Okay? Again, and I know it probably sounds gray, but it is important, not just for abiding by state rules and things, but also for how the interaction feels between the provider and the individual, you know, so that the individual feels like the provider is that you're working with me. An example I've used other times, or kind of an idea, is it really should never be the individual versus the provider. If you guys can see me on the screen, right? So we've got individual versus provider, okay? If it's like that, well, who do we want to win? You want the individual to win? That means you guys lose. But if you guys win, well, that means the individual loses. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if you set it up like that in a versus situation, somebody's gonna lose. Somebody has to be defeated in order to get things on board. It is much, much, much better for the process to be the individual and the provider together versus whatever the problem is, right? So if it's a matter of going to bed at 10 o'clock at night, hey, I'm here to help you to make sure you've got enough sleep to get up in the morning so you can go do whatever it is they want to do. If it's going to work, if they've got, an activity of some sort they're doing, if it's just a matter of feeling good and getting enough sleep, blah, 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 all this, you're providing that structure and that support for them. To say, hey, I want to make sure you get enough sleep so you can feel good, so you can, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever that looks like for whatever the person you're working with. And I realize for some people that don't have as much verbal abilities, may not be talking as much, but it still should feel different than me saying, hey, you got to go to bed now. Okay? Again, this is not about being the word police, but it's kind of about, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Very black or white kind of thinking process, which is either, well, look, I'm the one paid to take care of them, so I have to be in charge, and I have to make sure that I am in charge of every single thing, because otherwise, who knows what's going to happen. Or, Well, okay, fine. They have rights. I guess they can do whatever they want. And if they want to stand naked in the middle of the road, dance around, get run over by a car, well, I guess you told me that's their right, and that's okay. Well, fine. That's what it is, right? Robin's laughing. That's good. At least that's good. That's good. At least that it's you're recognizing the ridiculousness of that. But that's the danger. That's if we pull it into one of those two camps, where it's either, well, fine, let them do whatever they want. That's what you told me to do. Versus I've got to rule over somebody with an iron fist. It can't live in either of those two extremes, okay? What this really is about is how am I working with this person to help them be safe and happy? The job that you guys have, then this is going to sound like a controversial statement, but the job you guys have, a lot of people say, well, it's my job to keep them safe. I would argue that's actually not true. Now, that doesn't mean you want them to be unsafe. What that means is if they are, your job really is to help them have a quality of life. Okay? Can you have quality of life if you're not safe? No. You can't have a quality of life if you've been run over by a car in the middle of the road. You cannot have quality of life. The danger is you can be safe and not have quality of life. If my job is to make sure somebody never gets run over by a truck, then in theory, I can do my job by never letting them leave their bedroom, right? I install a little toilet in the corner of their bedroom. I put a steel door on their bedroom door. I cut a food tray slot in the door so I can pass them food in and out, and I stick a padlock on that door. If I do that, are they ever going to get run over? No, right? I can guarantee they won't get run over. Is that a ridiculous example? Yes, but that's what I'm trying to get to is the point of how is this really working for this person and ensuring their quality of life, okay? So when we're doing restriction analysis, again, it gets back to this idea of the ability to control. So is this support truly preventing, stopping the person from doing something he or she wants to do? Example. If I've got a bed rail that prevents somebody from leaving a bed, that does not allow them to leave a bed, that is probably restrictive, okay? Now, again, not saying that whether or not that restrictive is appropriate or not. I'm not getting into that at this point. I'm just saying we got a bed rail up, it will not allow that person to leave. That's probably a restriction. If I've got a pressure mat in front of that person's bed that just notifies the staff when they're getting out of bed, that's not restrictive because it's not preventing them from getting out of bed. It's me using a sensor to kind of be aware to interact with them, right? To come check and see what's going on. Because in both of these cases, that would be my first question. If they say we got a bed rail, why is the bed rail up, right? Why is there a need for a bed rail? Is this because this person's trying to get out of bed, or is it because they're inadvertently rolling out of bed? Do they have the ability to get the bed rail, take the bed rail down, or put the bed rail up? These get into these questions about ability to control. Okay. Again, does the person have the choice to say no to the support? Do they resist it, but they're forced? They're required. They have to. Okay. Enforced is the really key word there. So now, again, if somebody really doesn't want to do something, they're really reluctant, and you got to give them a lot of verbal prompts, and you basically still talk them into it. That's not restrictive. Now, threatening them can get restrictive. If you don't do this, I won't let you do that. That's different than verbal prompts, okay? Similarly, if I'm sticking a seatbelt on somebody in a wheelchair when that person doesn't want it on or they're unable to do it, and notice I'm saying at a kitchen table here, that's going to be restrictive. Now, again, that's separate from whether or not the restriction's appropriate. Are they a really serious fall risk, and they might, if they stand up without staff right there, they might fall over and break a hip, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe that's an appropriate thing. But regardless, if we're sticking a seatbelt on somebody and they're yanking and yanking at it and they don't want this thing on, that's going to be restrictive. I'll get to seatbelts and transportation in a second. So that's just stick with me on that example as far as like at the wheelchair, in the wheelchair at the kitchen table. You guys see why I said if you've got specific things popping off in your head, talk to your SSAs, because the devil's in the details on every one of these things. Every one of these examples, there's always well, what about this? Well, where does this sit? And those can all influence how these things look, okay? If I'm considering the person's choice and intention, is the person intentionally trying to do this? So before I dive into these examples, let me go back to the guy with the bed, right? If I've got a bed rail that I'm using up for this person, and that bed rail is up because they unintentionally roll over in their sleep and they roll out of bed. And this has happened to them numerous times before, and it's really serious. And they're fine with the bed rail being up. It's like, no, I don't want to fall out of bed. That's not restriction, because they are not trying to get out of bed. They're inadvertently putting themselves in danger while they're sleeping, okay? If you stick that bed rail up because this person tries to get up in the middle of the night and smoke, I worked with a guy who had lit his cigarettes off the gas stove and was in danger of catching his hair on fire while the staff were asleep. And I'm saying, well, yeah, I'm not going to let him get out of bed by putting a bed rail up so that he cannot leave the bed under his own power. That's restriction. Not saying we want him lighting himself on fire, lighting cigarettes off the gas stove. Those are two separate questions. But the bed rail itself in that situation, that's restricted, okay? Similarly, I'm using a gate belt on somebody and they're trying to walk across the road, and I grab hold of their gate belt and physically use it to stop them. That's physical restraint or mechanical restraint, depending, but you're using something to prevent them from moving in a direction they want to, okay? Same person could have that gate belt on, and you might use that gate belt to stop them from falling because they've got a weak gait. That's not a restriction. So this is important to think about. Sometimes people say, well, is a gate belt restrictive or not? The gate belt in and of itself is not restrictive. How are you using it? I could use a gate belt as a medical support, or I could use a gate belt as a restriction. Depends, okay? If I'm locking the front door specifically to prevent somebody from leaving who's trying to leave the house, as opposed to just locking a door as part of general community safety, okay? If I'm applying a seatbelt lock during transportation, and notice I said seatbelt lock, not using a regular seatbelt, but like a lock on an extra lock on the seatbelt, because this person tries to open up their car door, that's different and a restrictive and possibly an appropriate restriction. We've approved those before. As opposed to saying, I'm using a seatbelt for general transportation safety. The person can't operate the seatbelt themselves, but they also don't care that the seatbelt's on. And yeah, we don't want them flying around when they're inside the vehicle, okay? Questions so far? Okay, I know this is a lot of, I'm throwing lots of stuff all over the place at you, but like I said, we got about 8 more minutes here of your time. I'm just going to kind of keep popping through these. So if something pops off to you guys, say something. Cut me off, flag a hand, throw something in the chat, and Sarah can keep an eye on, do something like that, okay? If it's restrictive, it probably means the provider is in power. So is this being implemented as something that's a consequence by staff decision or by the provider's decision? Okay, so look at that first example. I got somebody that the staff refused to transport somebody to a mall 3 days after they hit somebody. They hit somebody. 3 days later, they ask to go to the mall. The staff says, no, you're not going to the mall because you lost your outing because you hit that person. That's restriction, okay? And that also kind of gets back to some old school ideas about earning rights, earning options, things like this. Very, very, very few of those things have been approved anymore as appropriate uses of things. That's not to say that it couldn't be, but again, we would have to show this is literally the only thing we can use to help keep this person safe, okay? Contrast that with, we're getting ready to go to the mall, we're getting ready to go out and go do something. This person has a meltdown and they've completely lost it. Is it smart for you to immediately turn around and put them in the vehicle while they have the meltdown or immediately after the meltdown? No, that's not necessarily safe. But that's if you're saying, hey, you seemed really upset. Why don't we take 15 minutes? Let's chill out a little bit. Let's watch a little bit of TV. Let's listen to some music. We're still going to go to the mall. We're still going to, not that Springfield has a mall anymore, but we're still going to go to wherever. We're going to get some ice cream, and we're going to do all that fun stuff you're going to do. But we're just waiting 15 minutes. So I'm not saying you're not allowed. That I'm saying let's just give it a little bit of time. Okay. I'm putting a little bit of a buffer in there. as opposed to me using it as a penalty for something that they did. I'm just saying, hey, it's important for us to be safe. Let's take some time to be safe right now. Let's take time for everybody to calm down. You guys see the difference in that? Understand that? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep going here. I want to touch base on this real quick because this gets into this next one, this guardian and natural support thing. So the example I've got here is a natural support tells the provider not to take the individual to church if the individual isn't wearing a tie. Okay. First of all, that is restrictive. Second of all, and that would not be an appropriate restriction. What is the risk of harm of somebody not wearing a tie to church? Okay, there is none. Now, here's the difference. If I'm natural support, or I'm mom, or I'm guardian, or I'm whoever, and I drive Johnny to church, and I have told Johnny, look, when we go to church, we look good. We dress up. This is really important to me. This is part of our church culture. If you're not going to be dressed to the nines, I'm not taking you to church with me. If I'm natural support, if I'm guardian, and I'm the one driving him, that's my choice to do that, right? Okay, because they're not getting paid for that. This is where the shared living thing comes in, right? This is where it can be kind of important to really think about this, that if I'm working with somebody, if I'm saying you're not allowed or we can't do this, what is the context for that? Okay. Because obviously in a case like this, that's going to be a real stretch. Now, if it's really important to look really nice for church, if this person you're trying to help this person, everybody else in the church is dressed really, really nice, and they come in with ripped up jeans and like a Metallica t-shirt with stains all over it, they're going to stand out a little bit. It's not necessarily a risk of harm, but that may be a time to say like, hey, I want this to be an enjoyable experience for you. What can we do to help this be a little bit better? Okay. Let me get to that. I want to make sure I get to this one. And then this is probably going to be the last slide, guys, just so I'll give you a couple of minutes here to talk. This one might get a little, I was figuring the agency providers would really raise some questions about this, because when we are dealing with people's money, it is really, really important that we don't get arbitrary in deciding when people have access to their money and when they don't. Okay, and maybe arbitrary is not the right word, but the example I want to use here is this, and it's under that first bullet point. So if I've got money that I need to use for Special Olympics bowling, and bowling's going to be on Saturday, and that money gets dropped off at my house on Wednesday, and we know that if I get hold of that money between Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it's not going to be there for Saturday. I'm going to spend it on something else. The temptation a lot of times is to turn around and then say, well, I'm going to lock that money up and keep that money away from that person because they need to use it for Saturday. Here's the thing. If they can handle money typically, that is their money to decide what they want to use it on. Okay. Now, this can get frustrating for people sometimes because this is a matter of, well, look, it's really a lot easier for me to have it, drop it off on Wednesday, and then I can do this, et cetera, et cetera. And I get that. But the problem is this, there's literally a rule in state law, in the state code, in the ORC, that says restrictions cannot be used for convenience. Like it's right in there. They can point directly at it and say that's in contradiction to that. Okay. So if we're working with people on money, I think it's important to think. Now this is separate from if somebody truly doesn't understand money at all. They don't understand money. They don't understand the value of it. They don't know what it's used for. They will, throw it out, set it on fire, give it away to somebody without having an idea, eat it in some case. If they literally don't understand what money is, I'm not saying give somebody a wad of cash and say, well, it's yours to do with whatever you want. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying, if you're saying, well, I'm going to give you money now for something later on, even though I know you can't wait for that thing later on, but I'm going to put it in your house, but then kind of like hide it from you, that's a problem. And I know that's occurred in some situations where I've had people who've actually gotten mad, and we've actually had quote unquote behavior problems happen because we've had individuals start trying to break into their medication box. We say, well, why are they trying to break into their medication box? Well, because there's money locked up in there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is creating a problem, right? This is making things worse. Okay.
If ever you come across a situation where you're not sure, if it doesn't quite feel right, or it feels like it's right in that line, feel free to reach out. That's what we're here for. As Sam said, the first call should go to the SSA because they're going to be the one most familiar with the case, the person's circumstances, and all of that. So definitely reach out. But we're all here and happy to answer questions and provide assistance. So.
All right. Like I said, guys, thanks for your time. So
Thanks.
definitely reach out if you need anything. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.